So I want us to kind of look at a reading that actually is not from the Lord's Prayer, but from the first epistle of St. Peter. It's one of the epistles that I remember reading much later in my life compared to the famous books. And it's really rich in kind of the picture of what a real Christian looks like. It really portrays a clear picture of what we ought to look like. That's where he speaks about add virtue to your faith and add patience to your virtue and so on until he gets to love as a perfection. In this combined reading, okay, he speaks about two things. He speaks about, and we're going to see how they relate to submission. It's not very far-fetched. In verse 5 through 7 of chapter 5, he says, "Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you." And in this first reading, he goes into the sort of the passive understanding of God's will. Okay, that I receive it. Okay, that there are two folds to life of submission. Okay, there is a passive part, and passive not in a negative connotation, but passive in I am receiving, I am under God's hand, okay, and I'm receiving, okay, His actions, be it through the world, be it through other people that I cannot overcome, being through government, being through whatever it is. God works in many, many, and through many, many channels. And in this I'm saying, what St. Peter is advising us to do is humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you. Okay? And this may cause me some discomfort, obviously. The second part, which is from chapter 2, so technically before it, okay, if you look at the parts I underlined in verse 15, "For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." Live as free. Okay? But restrict your freedom. See, what's a bit confusing was to me, okay, when I first started reading this, is what do I understand my freedom to be? What does it mean to be free in the first place? Because I can't submit. If I'm going to submit to anything, I am giving up this freedom. Okay, or in a certain way negotiating a border between submitting and being free. But I think that I wasn't very clear, I personally wasn't clear about what is my freedom. And why was it too bothersome to me to pray thy will be done? I grew up, I mean, obviously in a certain generation, okay, and the understanding, the current understanding in general of freedom, okay, is that freedom means I can do anything I want, anytime I want, as long as I'm not, hurting literally somebody else, okay, and I have no limits, no restrictions. That is freedom. That's the idea that I have learned from the culture around me and through growing up. That is not part of the church teaching. But the problem with this modern understanding, and it's the reason that we get this level of discomfort, is it's actually unreal. There is no such thing. There is no freedom that is limitless, that is restrictionless, that is endless. That doesn't exist. We're chasing a phantom, something that can happen. Okay? And it's not just the Bible that's saying that. It's definitely not me saying that. Okay? It's a known fact from the ancient Greeks. This gentleman here has been dead for quite a while. Okay? And he used to be a poet. And Euripides. And what he said is no one is actually truly free. At the time, he said, they're slave to wealth, fortune, the law, or other people restraining them, essentially people they're trying to please. Okay? In his opinion, in his observation, there is no one who's actually really free. Okay, not that people are all enslaved, but that they live for something. There is something that's their highest allegiance. Okay? And it's that thing that restricts their freedom. So there's nothing called limitless. Okay? We've all heard about, for example, someone who has commitment issues. Okay? They like to be independent all the time. Okay? Well, they are slave to that independence. They can't get out of that. They may want to have a vulnerable conversation at some point in time, but they can't do it because it threatens their independence. It gives someone an upper hand on them, and they can't do that. They won't let that happen. They may want to, but they won't let it happen. Even the most extreme sort of form of freedom is actually not real. I am enslaved to something. I have already submitted to something. The point I'm trying to make, okay, is not far from obviously what we all know, the picture. It's what our Lord said. There is, when we talk about life of submission, okay, we have to acknowledge that it's not a point of between I am free and then I am going to submit. We are all submitted to something or someone. We're just changing allegiances. We're not giving up this mythical form of freedom that never existed in order to submit to God. That's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what we're actually being asked to do. Okay? We're just changing allegiances. That's really what's happening right now. Or that's really what the life of submission says. And this is what our Lord teaches, right? He tells us, okay, if you abide, this conversation happened with the Jews in John chapter 8. And in it, I'll read the full reading for you guys. It says, "So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, 'If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.' They answered him, 'We are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?' So Jesus answered them, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever.'" Okay. He was saying the same thing. He was saying, they made the same reaction. Okay? We've never been enslaved to anyone. Why are you keep in mind, they're being occupied by the Roman Empire at the time. So there's some serious denial of reality at this point. Okay? Because as far as the Romans were concerned, the Jews were their slaves. Okay? Not in formal terms. Okay? But we are the offspring of Abraham. We're free. No, you're not. And it's the same thing with us. The reality is, whatever we practice, whatever is our highest allegiance, okay, is really what we have submitted to. You can call it anything. Okay? And what St. Peter was saying is live as free, but not use this freedom as a cover-up. Live as servants, as slaves to Christ. And in that, you'll get your highest form of freedom. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit. What we're saying, actually, we practice every day. Think about going on a diet. I tend to be a fan of this show. Okay? And Homer has a particular issue with eating. Okay? So, the idea is, if I were to eat unlimitedly, if I unrestrictedly let myself eat, okay, all the time, then most likely, according to my doctor, I'm going to have a reduced lifespan, okay, and it will not end in a very comfortable manner, okay? So I have to restrict my freedom and submit to a different form of freedom. Or otherwise, the other example is for a fish. Imagine if a fish learns our understanding of freedom and decides, I want to go on shore and I want to see what these shore people are doing. Okay, the fish will get out of the water, and what will happen to the fish? Will it be free? Okay, I think we've all saw fish out of the water before. So without going overly dramatic, the point is that the best and the highest form of my freedom is within some form of restriction created by my maker. The fish is most free in an aquatic environment. Has the maximum amount of freedom, has the maximum amount of potential, can go, come back, live, sleep, wake up, breathe, everything else. The maximum amount of freedom is within the context created by its maker. What we've been talking about so far, I'm just making the case that it's actually happening in nature. This is something not a foreign concept. And this myth that freedom is this limitless, endless thing is just not real. Which is why, for example, sometimes you see folks who have achieved a great deal of wealth, a great deal of fame, which technically, according to what the world or the cultural understanding of freedom, should give them limitless freedom. They really can do anything they want. They have the resources for it. They certainly have the time for it. Okay? And they have the amount of power needed for it. And they still choose to end their lives. Because it's not real. There is no actual, the sort of freedom that the culture promises doesn't actually exist at the end of the tunnel. It's just not there. So we can see that notion very, very early on in the Bible, where we understand that having a life of submission and what Christ and what God is actually asking us for is that He becomes our highest allegiance. It's not that we're not going to desire nothing else. It's not that we're not going to be afraid from anything else. Okay? It's not that we're not going to want anything. All of these things are human, created by God, and they are great. It's just that His is our highest allegiance. In the first commandment of the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. It's not that you're not going to have other important things. You're not going to have other gods before me. Yeah. What is it that defines my life that if it goes missing, I just can't get over? The story that impacts me most, the narrative that impacts me most, is when I hear, or when I heard it, at least when I was prepping for this topic, I prayed for this thing. Okay, I asked God for it many times. He didn't give it to me, so I said, "Goodbye, God. I don't want you anymore in my life." The problem with this narrative is that this thing, whatever it is that I was praying for, became more important than God. It became a lower cap God. And when I couldn't get that thing, whatever it may be, and it may be good, it's not that it's a bad thing, okay? It became my God. And off I go. When the crash happened back in 2007, 2008, they actually, I'm an architect by profession, they actually started putting some restrictions on access to rooftops in Hong Kong, one of the richest, call it, countries in the world. Okay? Why? People were throwing themselves off skyscrapers quite a bit. Why? Because their highest allegiance was the wealth and power that they had. And when that came crashing, they just couldn't deal with it. It defined who they are. There's a difference between wanting to be healthy and being a hypochondriac. Okay? St. Paul gives us an example of that, right? St. Paul had some form of a thorn in the flesh. I heard many definitions for it. A wound that kept bleeding. I don't really know exactly what it is. But it was a thorn in the flesh, and he prayed to the Lord 3 times. And apparently, to St. Paul, praying for something 3 times is a lot. He usually prayed once, and God did it. Okay, I assume, I take that as the, because I begin to wonder after 3 years. Okay, so, but apparently for St. Paul, 3 times was, I prayed to the Lord 3 times. Can you believe that? Okay? And then God told me, my grace is sufficient in your weakness. It's sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So what does he go after that to say? Okay? He says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness. Look at that reaction compared to the reaction of, and this is a wound, a thorn. This is not even something that, like, God, I'm serving you. I'm doing all these things. I'm going on all these mission trips. It would make sense to make me healthy. Like, you're making me miserable in what I actually do. Okay? But his reaction is, I'll be more glad in my weakness. That's an allegiance. That's his highest allegiance is not what God gives him. It's not even how God treats him. Okay? It's God himself. And he understands and learns what even the thought of God is towards him in the verses after this. Yeah. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. Because the strength of God comes through me. He gets, that's why I guess that's why he's simple. So, or one of the reasons what makes him, there. But anyway, so what we talked about so far is, what is it? What is a life of submission? Okay, and we understood the parameters, we understood the restricted freedoms. You either listen to the first 8 slides or what was discussed in the discussion and you got the point, right? And I just wasted some of your time. But what does it bring? Okay, what does this life of submission bring? Let's say I pursue a life of submitting to God, thy will be done, live as free but not as a cover-up. Okay, what do I get out of that? There are 3 things that are direct fruit from a life of submission to God's will. Okay, many others, and these are just 3. It frees me from over-desires, intense desires. Remember the example of somebody throwing themselves up from a roof or something? It's great to be healthy. It's not great to be a hypochondriac who's terrified, and I a little bit know about that. Okay, from my wife telling me to stop Googling WebMD. Okay, it's a really bad idea. Okay, especially if you have 0 medical knowledge. It frees me from over-desires. For the time past may suffice to have wrought the desire of the Gentiles, and to have walked in lasciviousness, lusts, wine bibbings, I'm not sure, revelings, carousings, and abominable idolatries. Okay, one of the words here, which I had the pleasure of knowing in Greek, epithymia. Okay, and it's either lasciviousness or lusts. One of them, I don't really know exactly in the interlinear Bible which one. But it speaks to not desires which are okay to have. We're not Stoics. We're not going to be, with no desire. But it's the intense thing. The thing that's before God. The thing that if I don't get, okay, that's what the actual word means. It doesn't mean sexual lust in this verse. That's not what it's talking about specifically, at least. Okay. It's speaking about a form of desire that is so intense that it drives me. Okay? And in that, St. Paul is saying, if you pursue a life of submission to God's will, you will be healed of that sort of intense desire. My desires will come under control. One of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, says that if you imagine that our life's desires have numbers, 1, 2, 3, so on. If number 1 is the first, then all the numbers fall in order. And if number 1, who's God, is not the first, then it's chaos. Okay? When I submit to God, when number 1 is God for who He is, all the other numbers fall in order. And I'm at my most freedom, my most potential as me. Okay? And if I'm not, then I'm not. Then everything goes into chaos. The second thing that it does, it frees me from over fears. When we were talking, you guys mentioned comfort. Okay? You mentioned that you feel God's will is good. And that's what this is talking about. It frees me from over fears. Not that I'm not going to be afraid of anything. I'm not going to be made of ice. Okay, or I'm not suddenly going to be, given superpowers. But what it will do, okay, is it will heal me from those over intense fears. So for example, okay, we're all born with a certain, or at least what I've been hearing recently is that we're coming back to the idea that we all have a certain temperament. Some of us are more anxious, some of us are more aggressive, some of us are more sunny. It's all sunshine and great. Okay? And none of these, now in some situations it's right to be anxious, in some situations I should be a bit more aggressive in action or active in trying to do something. In some cases it's good to expect a good outcome because life is quite miserable without that. Okay? But in other cases, you see there are three possible potentials for a situation and you write one of three times. Submitting to God's will comforts me in that I go against the grain, against my own grain, to overcome those intense fears, or those intense that it must be that it will be great. No, it's possible that it will not. But that's okay, because I can rest in the comfort will, okay, of the Pantocrator. I can rest on that. And that's what St. Peter earlier says, right? Casting all your anxieties on him. Going against that grain. A life of submission allows me to cast my anxieties. Cast my, oh, I should have acted on this thing, but I did. I can cast that. Okay, going against my own temperament sometimes, often at least 2 out of 3 times, to do this. One of my favorite saints is Saint Augustine. Okay, and Saint Augustine has a famous quote which I actually searched for in English, but couldn't find it. But I know it in Arabic, so I'm paraphrasing and translating on my own, which is a terrible idea, but I really did try. And he says this towards the end of his life. Okay, he says, "I stood on top of the world when I discovered in myself that I've desired nothing too intensely and feared nothing intensely in this world." He achieved his maximum freedom. He wanted things, and he had things, and he had one of the largest book libraries in the history of the fathers of the church that was actually preserved. They say that his book library was the only room that wasn't burned down by certain folks who took over the city. Okay, it was preserved. Okay, he had things, he acquired things, but he didn't have any intense fears. Okay, and he didn't have those intense desires that can take over his life, and he's still on top of the world. The third thing is a life of submission to God frees me to actually serve, give, forgive others. Okay. C.S. Lewis, again, has a quote that he says, "Forgiveness is a great idea to talk about until you actually have to forgive someone." Okay? It's great. It's noble. It's lovely. No one disagrees on it. Okay? Until you actually have to forgive. Because forgiveness has a cost. A cost of my ego, my pride, my own well-being, to forgive. To actually forgive. Not the silly, stupid things, but real forgiveness. And if I submit to God, then I can actually forgive. It comes from Him. This I can do. I have that freedom that I can forgive, that I can actually give to others, that I can make promises to others and serve them because I am free to do so. And I know who am I doing it for. Without expecting them to say thank you and to give me fantastic awards and whatever else. Because in this case, I would have been serving me, not others. St. Peter goes as far as live as people who are free, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another. Okay, in some translations it says, submit to one another. Okay, that's the level of what this submission is actually dealing with. All right, so we saw what it is. We saw some blessings that can come out of it. Well, then how do I grow in it? If you guys remember the verse from John 8 that our Lord spoke about, okay, He said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And in it, okay, when He speaks about you will know the truth and the truth will set you free, He's essentially saying that there is a component to actually going into this life of submission that has to do with a change in mind, of knowing something different. If I don't know anything different, then I'm not going to go anywhere. If I can't change my mind that this mythical freedom doesn't exist, if I can change my mind, if I can actually self-examine and find the truth of what is it that I'm submitting to and change that, okay, nothing will change. So, the first thing that I can grow in actually a life of submission is forming a habit of making a promise, a wish, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and straight out plagiarize from the talk, from Makar's talk a couple of weeks ago, okay, about how is it that I can form a habit. I make a promise, I make a wish, okay, and from that wish, okay, comes, at the end of it, comes an actual life of submission. So for example, okay, if I'm dealing with some difficult people, and I'm trying to get to a life of submission, one of the things about forming habits is it starts, like we learned a couple of weeks ago, it starts with actually making a promise, making a wish that I want to maybe deal with someone differently, maybe submit to someone, to something, to some event, to, you know, there are specifics to that, okay? I then go on to find the outcome of that, the blessing that may come out of this submission. Whether it's liberating, whether it's overcoming certain fears that have been kind of ingrained in me as I grew up, or whether it's actually improving a relationship. This life of spiritual submission, okay, requires me to go through making it a habit. Unless I do that, nothing will happen. I make a promise, I find what the outcome is, okay, I look at the obstacles that may be facing me, okay. Maybe it's I'm trying to deal with a difficult person or difficult people. People, not that go along my particular taste. One of the things I heard once by someone, by the way, and I thought it was kind of cool, is he said, I can guarantee you that in heaven, everyone there is not going to be exactly up to our particular taste. So we better get used to the idea of difference, okay? Or it's going to make eternity a little uncomfortable, okay? So, but moving on from that, there are obstacles to any actual life of submission. There are obstacles. Maybe the person or the people are going to bother me, and I'm going to need to cast this anxiety on the Lord, okay? But then I can make a plan, and I can reach the outcome, the blessing. Moses, the prophet, who once was so hot-tempered that he killed the man, okay, who was beating one of his brothers, okay, was later on described as the most patient man on earth. When he submitted, and at the age of 80, went back to Egypt to grab about roughly 500,000 people, as far as I heard, okay, and brought them out in the desert and had to deal with 500,000 people of requests, crankiness, God knows what else, when you're taking 500,000 people on a journey in the desert for quite a few years, okay? He got to, literally, the Bible, and the Holy Spirit does not lie, the most patient man on earth. I mean, if that's not an outcome of a life of submission, then I don't know what is. Okay? Because that tremendously improved his relationships, by the way. Okay? It required an angel to hide his body because they were going to worship him. Okay? I mean, that doesn't happen unless people really like you. Okay? Forming a habit and actually executing a plan. And, you know, the series actually relates to it. The second part about life of submission is, and it's really almost a part of how do I change my mind, is to meditate and to look at the cross, to look at the sacrifice of our Lord, and how did he win by losing? Okay, we all remember the last night in Gethsemane, in the garden, okay, when he prays and says, if you, and I'm paraphrasing, if you will to pass this cup, then please do, but not as I will, okay, but as you will. But let not my will, but your will be done. When he gave up fighting God, as an example for us, when he no longer is fighting with God about whose will works, he moved on to fight the real enemy. The sin that imprisoned all of us, death. And when I surrender to God's will, I move on to actually deal with the real issues, the gods that were before God in my life. Okay, I move on to deal with them, and I have God's power along with me. Okay, but when I insist that, no, it's my will that has to be done, okay, I lose that. I keep on in a, and I don't know it in English, so forgive me, but when Jesus appeared to St. Paul on the way to Damascus, okay, he told him, it's just hard for you. Just don't keep fighting it. It's just too hard. You're not going to get anywhere with it. It's not like I'm going to bend God's will to me. Okay? Although, one of my favorite authors said that there are two types of people in the world, okay, on Judgment Day. Ones who say to God, thy will be done, and others who God say to, thy will be done. Okay? And it's, our will usually doesn't lead into much goodness. So, if I want to summarize what we actually talked about, okay, we went through the definition of what freedom is and what submission is, okay, and it's a change in allegiance. It's not like God is asking me to give up this boundless, limitless thing to kind of, go and serve Him, okay. What does it look like in daily life? The eating, the unlimited eating, the fish as a metaphor. Metaphors tend to work for me as much as they work for Joe as well, from what I heard. The blessings of this freedom come in many, many ways, and in very, very special blessings. And many marriages were saved by kind of a life of submission between the two partners. But one of them is it eliminates over-desires. It eliminates intense fears, okay, or combats them. And it increases and gives me the liberty to actually give myself, forgive others, make promises. Because the highest form of freedom, okay, is when I can actually give myself. Okay, it's the highest form of freedom. Not when I can give 10 minutes of my time. That's cool, but... And if I were to grow in it, then there are two things that I can do practically to help me grow. One is change my mind and start making promises, okay? And make those promises into habits. Not empty words, but starts making a habit. And a habit, as we learned, starts with a wish, with a promise, with a goal. And then the second part is to meditate on the cross, to understand that this concept of winning by losing, that the life of submission, to win by losing, is something that Christ first pioneered.